Welcome everyone to today's presentation, People, Practice, and Transformational Change. My name is Duncan and I'm a community animator with the Tamarack Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce this webinar with John Kania. Now, before we get started, we just wanted to take a moment to recognize the land that we're meeting on. We begin this discussion by acknowledging that we're meeting on Indigenous lands, and as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I myself am calling in from Mississauga, Ontario in Canada, the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And I encourage you to take a moment and enter into the chat what land you're joining today's call from. It's now my pleasure to introduce our host for today, Liz Weaver.
Thanks so much, Duncan. I'm calling in from the city of Hamilton, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. So welcome everybody to this webinar. We're really excited to have John Kania joining us today and to hear about his new venture. I'm going to read you a little bit of John's bio for those of you that don't know him, although I would expect that a lot of people on the call, John, know you and are quite familiar with your work. So John has been a practitioner, researcher, writer, teacher, and speaker on how organizations and people can achieve big change together. For 17 years, he built and ran FSG, a nonprofit consulting firm and think tank working globally across issues and sectors to support social and environmental change makers. From 2018 to 2020, he served as an executive in residence at a national venture philanthropy, New Profit, co-leading the launch of a systems change practice. As his career evolved, John has explored with increasing depth what it takes to achieve change collectively. And I think that's really exciting for me because I think a lot about this as well. In 2011, he co-authored the article Collective Impact, which remains Stanford Social Innovation Review's most ever read article. The theory and practice of collective impact has spread across the globe, has been honed and enhanced by thousands of practitioners and by many initiatives. So welcome, John, to the call.
Thank you, Liz. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's really exciting to have you. I know our paths have crossed quite a bit over the last number of years. I think maybe I was, when you published the article around collective impact, I and Tamarack were one of the first people to reach out to you from Canada, I think, to say, hey, that's a really interesting article.
Yeah, that was fun. I have to say, I'm just really fond of Tamarack and you, Liz, and many of your colleagues and Paul. We've had a great opportunity to interact on a number of things over the years. I have to say, Tamarack and really the work that's going on in Canada around systems change has always been, a great source of learning for me. And I think there are a lot of people operating in a fairly, sophisticated level when it comes to thinking about collective change and systems change in Canada. So it's just delightful to be here for this conversation, and I hope I'll take away some things from all the folks on the phone and you as we have this conversation.
Great. Yeah, I think as we dive into it, it's always so great to learn from each other. So let's begin. I know about, was it a month ago or maybe even 2 months ago now, you sent us some of your early thinking about this collaborative change lab and asked for some feedback. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been, how your thinking is evolving and about the change lab?
Yeah, sure. So just a little bit of a backstory. We published the article on collective impact back in 2011, and at the time I was running FSG, which is a nonprofit sort of consulting firm and think tank in the social sector, and up until that time, most of my work in terms of working collectively with people had been within an organization. And thinking about how do you foster the conditions for an organization to grow and develop over time. And it was really with the advent of the collective impact work and research that we did around that we started actually practicing in the collective change area, collective impact area. And, the decade from 2011 till, almost decade till I left FSG about 2 years ago, that was really where I was spending the majority of my time. And I have to say that, in some respects, I felt like I fell into my home. That doing the work of, collective change, collective impact was sort of, I just had never felt so alive in my life. And I think what's interesting is if you talk to a lot of people who are, practice in the collective change area, you hear the same thing. It's something that, if you're drawn to it, it's a calling. And so for me, this is sort of like the next stage in what I feel like, I'm supposed to be doing and was meant to be doing. Why are we doing this? And here's the challenge, that at a community, regional, and global level, most attempts around collective problem solving today, at least that I've seen, are really, at their best achieving incremental progress, and that's great. But the ways we're working together aren't deep enough, disruptive enough, or exploratory enough to sort of go beyond the incremental. So the Collective Change Lab, with an emphasis on the fact that, it's a laboratory of experimentation and co-creation, is hoping to meet this current moment by providing what we're calling practical inspiration, insight, and guidance around transformational collective change. We use, many people, I use that word probably more loosely than we should, but transformation is something turning into something else, something that's more mature, something that's more connected. And it's going to look different coming out than it did going in. And so how do we actually set the conditions for that level of change to actually happen, so that people aren't sort of coming to the table and leaving the table, and they may be sort of aligning and coordinating, but fundamental transformational change hasn't taken place. And my examination around this really began a couple of years ago. So some may have seen this. A couple of years ago, we published an article around systems change, and we developed this frame called the 6 conditions of systems change, and said that the best definition I've seen of systems change came from Social Innovation Generation in Canada, that said that systems change is about shifting the conditions that hold problems in place. And I thought that was great. It was like the first time I'd ever really heard somebody sort of develop and articulate systems change in a way that was evocative and that I could relate to, shifting the conditions that hold problems in place. The next question, well, what are the conditions? And well, as we looked at this, we said they're not 30 conditions, they're not 2, but we saw 6 conditions that in general we saw in most systems change, really all systems change initiatives, but they were happening at 3 different levels of visibility and depth, if you will. And so we called the first level structural change, which is policies, practices, and resource flows. The second level, relational change, which is about relationships and connections and power dynamics. And then the deepest form or deepest condition around systems change we call mental models. And as you can see in the parentheses on the right, that when we're looking at structural change, it's explicit, it's visible, people can see it. When we look at relational change, sometimes you can see the power dynamics, sometimes you can't. And then when we get down to thinking about mental models, we call that implicit. In fact, that often it's just basically invisible in terms of sort of what is the condition of people and what are their mindsets and perspectives. And so, this has continued to sort of, I think, be helpful for many people who are in the process of trying to say, okay, how do we actually shift a condition? That you can't just shift one of these and hope that the system shifts. You have to shift all. And what's interesting is that within the formalized sector, if you will, where if we go back, the world of systems change, if you go back, 2 or 3 decades or more, really was oriented mostly, folks who were doing community organizing and movement building. That's really where the sort of concept came about. But over the last, decade and a half, there's been much more focus by people in the formalized dimensions of the system, saying we want to shift the system. But they often go to sort of thinking about this structural level, and they don't get down to the deeper levels. You know, one example I often give in the United States, the Affordable Care Act. Our neighbors to the north have a much more intelligent approach to healthcare than we do, but we've been wrestling with this idea of national healthcare for a long time. The Affordable Care Act in the Obama administration was a great example of a really, you know, phenomenal sort of potential system shift. But frankly, it was mostly concentrated at this top level and didn't get down to these deeper levels, and really, you know, really challenged when it came to thinking about shifting mental models around, you know, everybody deserves a right to healthcare, or even that, you know, healthcare, you know, universal healthcare could make us more competitive, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of ways to go that sort of just never came out. So one of the things that, you know, has become fairly clear as we think about systems change is that unless you're focused and spending a decent amount of your time thinking about the second and third, we call them the deeper levels of systems change, it's unlikely that you're going to sustainably and over the long term change a system. And when we look at movements as an example, most of the movements, I like to say, come from the bottom left and sort of go up, you know, sort of make their way up. They very much have structural change goals, but they really start most of their work at these second and third levels. And the opportunity for us going forward, as we think collectively, whether it's movements or whether it's formalized change, is to think more deeply about how we shift, often call the second and third levels, the cultural change versus the structural change. And I've seen wave after wave of reform in the United States around education, public education, for example. And every time sort of there's a new agenda built out, it's principally focused at that top level. And there's much less attention given to the second and the third levels, where in fact, this is where deep change occurs. So the orientation for the collective impact, collective change lab is to say, how do we actually work on those cultural levels? I mean, I see often people don't sort of want to work on those cultural levels for two reasons. One is, you know, they just think it's too hard, and two, you know, it's just not where their interest is, right? They'd much rather focus on policies, practices, and resource flows. But at the end of the day, unless we get better at these cultural dimensions, shifting these cultural dimensions of systems change, we're never going to get where we'd like to go. And this is where the transformational nature of systems change happens. So what is a collective change going to do about it? Well, one is we want to actually start to surface examples of initiatives and efforts that are actually working on those second and third levels of deep change. And the second is we want to sort of start to put more explicit, sort of name more explicitly what needs to go on there and what happens when cultural change occurs. So one of the things that's like really critical to get and understand about this, and you know, as I say this and as we put this up here, I want to be very clear that this is not something that, you know, this is being discussed by many people who are thinking around systems change throughout the world. So I'm guessing for many of you, I'm not the first person to say this to you, but we're in a mode where dominant culture, colonial culture, what has pretty much, you know, dominated sort of the world over the last 400 to 500 years, and was effective at sort of advancing the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, is not going to be the culture that allows for transformation going forward. And what you see here, and this is a list that was, and I've seen various versions of this list, but this particular one came from Terry Cross, who's in Alaska, and he's comparing in this example indigenous versus European, Euro-American ways of knowing. And again, many of you may have seen some versions of a list that looks like this, but wisdom aggregated over time versus knowledge that's new, things in their own time versus timelines, generosity and interdependence versus materialism and wealth and independence, collectivism versus individuality, cycles and phases versus steps and stages, holistic thinking versus compartmentalized thinking. And so these relational values are the set of values that are going to help us create conditions for transformational change. There are some very good things that can come out of these linear values. You know, if you're getting your knee replaced or your hip replaced, you know, there's great merit in the science that, you know, has actually sort of, you know, generated the you know, the tools and the various different, you know, dimensions of things that have allowed sort of certain aspects of, you know, the industrial and the mechanistic world to succeed. But if we're going to succeed in terms of transforming ourselves and communities and society and the world, we're going to need to sort of start to adopt, and in the manner that we're doing our social and environmental change work, adopt more of the culture and the values that are on the left. Now, I think that's kind of challenging, right? Because, you know, most of the world at this point, colonized, dominant culture. We're not going to change the entire culture of the world overnight, but we can start to think about sort of ways that we can put together containers being sort of the collaborative or the structures that sort of support collaboration and dialogue and learning. We can start to think about how we create more what I'll call radical containers that actually will allow for transformation. And here's a sort of an initial sort of cut based on sort of the work that we've been doing at 5 qualities of what we're calling radical containers. So I'll name and then talk about them in a little bit more depth. Focusing on inner change as well as outer change, deep relational work, cultivating space for healing, transforming power dynamics, and serendipity in the sacred. Deep relational work, enabling people to be seen for who they are and experience authentic connections. The focus on interchange, prioritizing change within oneself as a means of creating change in the world. Cultivating space for healing, supporting people in sharing their traumas and working to restore the harm done to them. Transforming power dynamics, building power among those who have been marginalized while equalizing accountability among all. And serendipity in the sacred, acting in right relationship with the earth and with others while inviting a universal source, which is love, to participate in the process. So we're starting to, again, work and sort of say, you know, coming out of many different wisdom cultures, spiritual cultures, what do they have in common? Because nobody has sort of a monopoly on what it takes to create transformational change. But we are seeing these level of commonalities. This is part of what we want to explore and say, okay, what are some basic sort of avenues to and ways of creating radical containers in the work that we do. And I want to talk very briefly about sort of one example of somebody doing this. We've just sort of written this case up. ROCA is a community-based organization serving high-risk young men and young mothers in Massachusetts and Baltimore. They work with sort of the most challenged of the challenged, you know, young men and young mothers who are coming out of prison, and they're trying to put them on a great path for life. And as many may know on the phone, you know, a significant percentage of people that come out of prison are, you know, reincarcerated within the next, you know, 2 years or so. ROCA has an amazing record and has created incredible results in terms of working with their youth. And one thing they use is peacekeeping circles. Some of you may have heard of these as well. And they learned about peacekeeping circles from the Tingit people in the Yucatan territories in 2000. And, you know, peacekeeping circles, circles in general, are used in restorative justice around conflict resolution, healing, deepened understanding. And, you know, they're about establishing sort of an intimate, non-hierarchical sort of, you know, container devoid of judgment. There's typically a facilitator. There's a talking stick. Only one person can talk at one time. And it's, you know, it's a really amazing sort of container with some very simple sort of protocols, but really powerful in its results. And I just want to talk about one recent one where they had recent circle where they had, you know, both youth and police and detectives there as well. And I'll just read from our case. In a recent circle ROCA was running there, There were some young people and 2 detectives from the gang unit. The circle discussion was focused on forgiveness, and one of the young people talked about the last time they'd been arrested. The young man had been living with his mother and her boyfriend, who was physically abusive to his mother. He came home on his mother's birthday to find her severely injured after the boyfriend had beaten her up and threw her down the stairs. The young man went out to look for the boyfriend, found him, beat him up, and then was arrested. During a break later on, one of the gang unit detectives approached the young man. He paused and then asked if he could ask him a question. The young man said yes. And this was the conversation that ensued. Was I there when it happened? Was I one of the arresting officers? Asked the detective. Yes, you were.
So yes, you were, said the young man. So when I showed up, was I okay? Asked the detective. Yeah, you were fine, said the young man. To be honest, said the detective, if someone did that to my mother, I don't know that I wouldn't have done the exact same thing you did.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I mean, just a snippet of an illustration of, a transformation taking place that, an hour earlier wouldn't have happened by what is a radical container. So this is the sort of work that we're trying to surface as a part of the Collective Change Lab. And just to wrap it up, and so what we're going to be focused on is research to surface cases like this, practice to actually engage in transformative change, and leadership development in terms of sort of, facilitating people who are interested in sort of taking this path. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Liz.
That it's so interesting to listen to you, John, and to kind of hear the thinking behind the Collective Change Lab, because I think, but in some ways it is an extension and a bit of a pushing on the collective impact work, kind of taking it to the next level, but also looking at other practice that might fit into this. And, it was interesting when you talked about, the 6 conditions that hold problems in place, and you went to mental models. In my mind, I said the word movement, and then you brought the word movement forward, because I think, one of the things that I've always believed in terms of collective impact work is this notion that the table itself, while good, is not sufficient, right? That we really have to turn outward, turn to community, and get the community to believe that they are part of the solution of the change that we envision. And so, yeah, so it's so interesting to hear your thinking about this.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we've been down the line for a while. And of course, I think in so many different ways, sort of the recognition that we can't separate the community from the more formalized players in this work, or vice versa. And I think in some respects, I think where we're, many of us are at, whether you're coming from the world of movements or you're coming from sort of the more formalized sector, is that it's that really hard dimension of sort of how do we put this all together, right? And I think that's what, many in the field are striving for.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Hey, so I saw when when you and I chatted prior to this call, I kind of saw some of this work rooted in the paper that you wrote a couple of years ago with Peter Senge and Hal Hamilton, called The Dawn of Systems Leadership. And so, how does the current approach kind of weave together with that, the ideas that you and your co-authors promoted in that paper?
Yeah, I think it is an expansion and it is an extension. Briefly, we talked about 3 capacities that system leaders need: the ability to help others see the complexity of what's going on, the ability to help people go deeper in reflection and dialogue, and then the ability to sort of coax and bring people from reactive problem solving to co-creating futures. And I hope, you saw in what I shared that a lot of that is there. It's just sort of trying to become more specific. I think, some of the sort of maybe new messages, if you will, I think continuous to what we were talking about, but, that, if we think about the field, much of the systems change activity is is focused in the wrong area, or at least in the wrong order, in terms of, starting with structural change. That would be sort of one message. One is that if we want enduring structure, another is if we want enduring structural change, we need to seek cultural change. And a third would be, this whole notion of the fact that dominant frames in much of the world are a large part of what's keeping us from, deep systems change. And I don't know that we use the language around those areas. I think we were, scraping through a lot of that. And we've also had the benefit of, since we published the article, learning from a great many others.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. My next question kind of talks about leaders. And so what can, and I almost think that system leadership is maybe not the complete right word. I don't know what the right word is, but how do we move to this, move beyond the kind of transactional, those first paradigms, to transformational? You talked a little bit about this in, giving us some sense of where the collective change lab is what your thinking is and where you're going. But what are some things that you would say to the folks on the call around this question, that the push often, which is on transactional, and the pull of transformational?
Right. Yeah. And, in the article, the article published Peter Senge and Hal Hamilton's Donna System Leadership, we talked about two reorientations, which I still find quite powerful and important. It was really Peter's initiative to sort of say, we need to show, indicate to people what are the gateways through which people sort of enter into this deeper work. And we talked about reorienting sort of two facets. One was your attention, and two was how you thought about strategy. The reorienting attention was really this notion that, if you want to create change out there, you've got to focus on change in here in yourself. And, I don't think you can do transformational work well unless you have some level of reflective, self-reflective practice. So we can call it contemplation, call it meditation. I don't think it requires, sort of formalized, religion to do this, but I do think it's really difficult to do this work well if you don't have some sort of self-reflective work that you're working on yourself. We can talk about specifically about what that means. For the purpose of time, I won't go into it, but it's a combination of knowing that you're going to need to get the change that you're interested in. There's something within you that's actually contributing to that, and that it's important to go through some self-discovery on that. And the second dimension is just getting to a place where you aren't so reactive, that you can deal with fairly intense stuff that's coming in. So that's a lot about sort of the in here versus out there dimension of reorientation. And the other is this whole notion of reorienting strategy. And I think that for me is really about sort of understanding that strategy is not in a PowerPoint document. It lives and it breathes, and it's in the place. I think people always talk about sort of, I want to drive change. I want to drive change. Well, the fact is you can't drive change. There's no such thing as one individual driving change. But you can create the conditions for others to arrive at a new place. And when we're talking collectively. And so I think those are two gateways that you've sort of got to wrap your mind around and say, those are things that I embrace and I want to do. And beyond that, it's a big learning by doing. I had a PhD student who was very interested in system leadership call me yesterday. And she said, I want to know how I do my next level of research. And as we got talking, I think it became clear to her that her next level of research, if she was going to do system leadership, was to actually do some of it, to actually think about how she could work with groups to sort of help them understand the complexity. And we talked about system mapping and, how she could think about sort of bringing folks to, a different level of dialogue and moving them from reactive problem solving to co-creating the future. And of course, all that's, not as easy as it may sound, or it may sound hard, because it is. But, it is a learning by doing practice. It is adopting the tools. It's a mentorship sort of thing. There's no one way that it all happens, but I think the first steps are, can you reorient yourself around sort of, making the space for collective wisdom instead of sort of driving change, and really understanding that there's got to be some inner work as well as outer work.
I have used the systems change with groups, right? And I think the inner and outer work, where I've seen the light bulbs come on or the true transformation come on, is when we ask the question, what are you doing to hold the problem in place, right?
Yes.
How are you contributing? And then all of a sudden people go, oh, I'm also part of the problem, right? And so, yeah, I think I think that inner work is so critical. So much has happened since that paper, and I think I can see the evolution of your thinking. If you think about the larger context, whether it's political, the equity context, the environmental, economic, how has that really contributed to thinking about this collective change lab?
Yeah, well, this is a $60,000 question. I mean, I think, like many people, I'm spending a lot of time, if we're in the work of collective change and we're in a more polarized society, and in some respects it feels like, how could we ever accomplish this work that we aspire to? But I think there's a certain amount of sort of doubling down on what actually supports transformation and what supports collaborative collective work. And there are a couple of things that I'm thinking about. One is, so I read an article about a year ago by a woman named Amanda Ripley. She's a journalist, and the title of the article was "Complicate the Narrative," and revise complexity in a time of false simplicity. And so in a polarized society, people go to their opposite ends, and it becomes very, sort of dualistic, if you will. And her basic message, it's a fascinating article if people are interested in reading it. It's beautifully done. But, she went through, for example, there's at Columbia, there's a difficult conversations lab. It's called Difficult Conversations Lab. And people who are diametrically opposed would sort of go in and be about something like gun control. And, some people would be, one individual would be given, two individuals sort of looking at this would be given perspectives that shared, like news reports that shared the sort of the very, different perspectives. And then another set of people would share a news report that basically was much more nuanced and much more sort of bringing together the issues. And it was those folks that basically read the more nuanced work that had better conversations. And that may, not sound surprising, but this whole notion that she had is we actually do have to complicate the narrative. We can't make it too simple for people. And I think that goes with sort of helping people understand the complexity, because if you can get them to support, and really dive into the various different nuances, that's important. I think the second thing is we're learning all over, everywhere we go, the power of narrative and the power of storytelling. But often I think we sometimes want to set that aside when we're talking about we've got to solve this problem, and we want to leave people's emotions out of it. And we're highly animated by stories, values, and metaphors, we as individuals, and sort of putting those more at the center of the work, I think, is becoming increasingly important, and is a shift that we need to make. And the last, as you introduced the call, you talked about the indigenous lands that we're on. I think it's becoming so clear in this moment in time, I think much more clear to me than it would have been 5 years ago, how much historical context matters in this, and how much we need to sort of go back and understand sort of, the full storyline, and how critical that is to gaining an understanding of the complexity that we have today. So I think these three things, and when you get into one of the areas we'll be looking at more is truth and reconciliation as a potential avenue for collective change lab work. And I think, looking at the places where people are really good at bringing in historical context and helping others understand it, I think is going to be critical. So there's just a couple of things that I've been thinking about in terms of sort of doubling down, if you will.
Yeah, I think the idea of story and narrative is really, really critical in terms of how we get better at communication. And so that leads me into my next question, which is, what are the bright spots that you've seen? And I know you shared the story about the work in Baltimore, but are there a couple of other examples that are top of your line of sight?
Yeah. So I wanted to put up a slide, Duncan. I don't know. Oh, you've got it up. Cool. Great. So this is one organization called Tamkeen Community Foundation in Morocco. Really interesting organization. We're still learning more about it, but they work at the neighborhood, large community level, and school or system level, and in sort of neighborhood development, education. Their key principles, they're totally focused on human potential, and as players that are helping the process, they facilitate the self-facilitating, is what they say. It's an entirely emergent process. They don't set goals up front or make plans to hit those goals. It's really a focus on facilitating people asking questions, observation, and self-reflection. And the picture that you see here is part of their education work. This is, I think you can actually, I've got it on a small screen, but you can read the French from one of the students, a 12-year-old, who's basically saying Tamkeen is nothing and Tamkeen is everything. And they really teach us to sort of think about and develop ourselves. And it's their entire orientation. And what's amazing is when they think about sort of measuring success, they measure what they call, their measurement is what they call manifestations. And it's basically about sort of the individuals who are involved, how they sort of describe a shift in sense of self, a shift in sense of sort of social coherence, and a shift in the sense of how they're co-imagining their futures. And you can see the dramatic sort of before and after picture that 12-year-old, drew just based on sort of the experience of this, the Tamkeen experience, if you will. The other example is Girl Trek. And Girl Trek was founded by two Black women in the US, Morgan Dixon and Vanessa Garrison, to address the health crisis among Black women in America. Now, for years in sort of the United States, the public health had sort of designed and been really thought about the primary driver of poor health outcomes among Black women was sort of, the fact that they were limited in their knowledge of fitness and nutrition. And but they didn't address the root causes, which go much deeper in terms of the social and structural stressors of inequity, like income inequality and underemployment and lack of leisure time. So Girl Trek actually goes into communities, and it's in essence a community organizing model of identifying local leaders who bring together Black women to walk 5 times a week for 30 minutes a day. And yes, it's actually a proven health intervention, but it also, is sort of bringing about healing. It's bringing about community. These, women become advocates for change in their communities. It's really powerful. 2 years ago, they were about 200,000 people. Now they're up to 800,000 women. They hope to be at 1 million by the end of the year. And if you go back to sort of the 5 qualities that I talked about in terms of healing and inner versus outer change, and relational and shifting the power structure, and bringing serendipity and the sacred in, they really embody all of those. They don't talk about them, but it's very much in their approach and in the culture that they're building in this initiative. So 2 that I'm really excited about there.
Great. Hey, I think we had 2 more questions, but I think we're going to jump to the last one because I also want to open it up for questions from the listeners. And I know we have a couple of questions sitting in the Q&A box. What's your, looking 5 years from now, what's your hope for the Collective Change Lab and the future of this work that you're engaged in? What's the biggest hopes that you bring to this work?
Well, I think, ultimately society needs a culture change in terms of how we think about social change and collective change, and we want to contribute to that. I think there are a lot of organizations, including Tamarack, that are working towards that and sort of see this. And I think we need to bring it more into, use the word I just used, manifestation. We need to bring it more to something that's at the front of, just in the way that we think about racial equity, and it really wasn't that much part of the conversation, unfortunately, 10 years ago. And it's a very different world today. And of course, this intersects with that. I think, having a different sense of how we think about, measuring change, how we think about what it is that we're looking for in the change process, moving from those linear values to those relational values. We hope that we can contribute to that. That's really my dream.
Wow, that's great. So thanks, John. And so maybe what we'll do is bring Duncan back into the conversation. I know he's been checking out the questions in the Q&A box. And so Duncan, what questions? I see that there's a couple there. So maybe we can tackle a couple of them, or we can ask John to tackle a couple of them.
For sure. And yeah, if you have a question and haven't yet asked it, you can use the Q&A panel on your Zoom client. And if you don't have a question, you can still open up the panel and use the thumbs up feature to vote on which question you'd like to see answered. Our first question comes from Gurpreet, and they ask, "Hi, John. Many thanks for sharing great frameworks and examples. Another conception of transformational change I've come across is one from Glenn Page and Michael Quinn Patton. Transformational change," and here's a quote, "Transformational change involves a different order of magnitude and speed than project-bounded changes. Transformation suggests major systems change at many scales across borders, sectors, and silos. The work must connect local to global and create collective action. I'm not suggesting that the two conceptions, yours and theirs, are completely at odds, but different things seem to be emphasized here. How might you reconcile between the two different frameworks?"
Yeah, thanks, Gurpreet. Yeah, I think, listen, my point of view is that we can't stay at the structural level forever and have intellectual conversations about how this all comes together. And I'm not suggesting that's what Glenn and Michael Quinn Patton are saying, because I'm aware of that work and know both of those people. But what I think is really critical is that we need to shift our lens more to the cultural dimensions here. I was involved in a conversation with a very extraordinarily thoughtful and great academic who'd been in sort of a officer in the state in education in a particular state, and very thoughtful guy, and he wanted to know the connection between policy and sort of cultural change. And I think there is often the assumption that if we change policy, culture change will follow. And I think that is possible. But I think right now we're in a state where it's easier for people to rely on changing policy, because as challenging as that is, it's often easier for people than changing culture. And so I think the definitions that you shared, Gurpreet, I think they're really good, but they're very focused on the what and not the how. Now, knowing both of those individuals, I know there's they're both deep thinkers, and there is an emphasis on the how and what they're talking about. But I think at least it's just in terms of the language that you talked about, we've got to go to this deeper level. And I think one of the other, sort of questions in here is, how do you scale if you're focused on sort of the cultural aspects, right? And that's part of what we is in the Collective Change Lab want to look at, because I think we need to be careful to assume that we can't sort of scale this cultural change. And I think we can. I think it diffuses. Diffuse may be a better word. But I think that we've just got to be careful about a temptation to go to, thinking about large scale change and glossing over, changes in relationships, changes in power dynamics, and changes in mental models. So just some thoughts on that.
I think you're right about that, John. I think it's the balance, right, of those. And we have given, the top, those transactional elements, we've given them more primacy because they're somewhat, easier to shift. But even, our mental models, some of the work that we've done at Tamarack around poverty. It's, when you have the deep conversations around your table about what are the mental models you're bringing into the room around this pretty complex issue, you can see that lots of people will bring different perspectives and different ways of knowing that issue, and through conversation actually shift their own thinking, right? So their thinking is, I always see it as a lens, but not the full lens, right? And so I think, yeah, I think that's, I think the power dynamics, the connections, the relationships, and the mental model, that's what I'm really hearing you talk about in this webinar.
Well, and I
Okay.
think it also goes back to the point we were talking about earlier that it's easier for people in the formalized structure in positions of power to talk about shifting that structural level. To engage in the other areas means sort of that they need to let go of certain dimensions of who they are and what they're bringing and what their organizations are bringing, and that's challenging. That's the bridge that we're trying to all cross.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Duncan.
Yeah, thank you both. Our next question comes from Heather, and they ask, it's fascinating to see love included in your model of transformational change. I've seen a lot of power in cultivating listening, inquisitiveness, and love in complex conversations and community work. I know the concept of love is coming up in many conversations across various fields, and more folks are getting comfortable with it, but I'm curious how this is received when you speak with folks about transformational change at this level. And I'll also add, we did have an anonymous question that relates to this, about working with groups where there's deep polarization and vocal opposition to, and they quote, touchy-feely stuff. So I'm curious on your take on that.
Well, I can tell you I've been on the receiving end of people who aren't happy about touchy-feely stuff and all sorts of dimensions of this. But, I think that comes back to the dominant culture. And I don't, it's the water we swim in. And I think many people, including and perhaps even especially people that are in power, don't know what they don't know here, and assume that, love entering into, I look, whoever decided that when we're talking about sort of how we're going to, sort of address homelessness and, community or, improve educational outcomes, that it was a bad thing to bring love and spirituality into the conversation. But yet many of our serious discussions about, those topics and others, it would be sort of anathema to bring those in. But, you just got to start doing it. And, I think many who do this work, that I've talked to, and it's been my mode as well. Some of it is you start doing it, or you do it in ways that people don't even know that it's there. Even the simple Liz, you talked about conversations, and Paul Bourne is so wonderful talking about conversations. Just getting people in a conversation, induces empathy and, compassion and love and all of these dimensions. But there's a real nature to this work that I believe in, and it's like, am I going to be able to prove it in 5 years? I don't know, but there's more than just me and you in the conversation. There's some other spirit, etc. Cultures outside of dominant culture recognize this and bring them right into the center. And that's why there's sacred ritual, etc. And so there is an assumption that that's wrong to do. Why? Because 500 years ago, somebody opened a university and said, okay, we're going to start segmenting what was a holistic way of looking things in terms of into specialization, and we're going to separate our heads from our hearts and our bodies. We've all been conditioned for 500 to 600 years on that, and it's not going to get us out of where we are. It's just not. So we need to find ways that we can bring the sacred and we can bring love into conversation, or into thinking about solving problems. Because if we don't, we're not going to get out of this. It's not just us here. We need that, universal source.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love that answer. Our next question comes from Heather. And they ask, can you suggest a resource related to measuring cultural change?
Ah, what a wonderful question, Heather. You've also stumped me. I think that's a good, or I know my colleague Juanita's on the phone from the Collective Change Lab. That's a good area for us to look at, along with other partners, potentially Tamarack. Because I think we're looking in the wrong direction when we keep trying to figure out how to measure this. This is part of the reason I brought up the Tamkeen effort in Morocco and the fact that they measure by manifestations. And I think more and more people who are doing this work around culture, et cetera, we know that the measurements are in the stories, and because that's how you can't describe complexity through indicators. You can describe complex relationships through stories. One area that we are looking at, and one area Peter Senge is looking at, so there's this notion of a relational field. If we think about containers to hold the work, the notion of a relational field says, is there sort of good juju going on there, if you will, in terms of what's happening, versus not, and are we seeing sort of, or is a group in flow, if you will, and Peter has his name for it right now is social generative field. Is there a social field in which generative work is happening, and can you measure that, and what does that look like? And there's you can go into two different classrooms in a school, and you can know where there's a positive relational social generative field in one classroom versus another, and that the teacher probably had something to do with that. So there are a number of people that are starting to think about this, and I do think it's the direction we need to go. Now, whether it's accepted by others who are thinking more of a dominant culture orientation, that's going to take a while. But again, it's the direction we need to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's also about, do people feel included, right? To what degree can we include people in the conversation, or to what degree do people see their place in that conversation? Yeah, I love the relational pieces. One of the things that we did when I was a long time ago back in Hamilton, we talked about how the community was working differently as one of our measures, and we captured that flow of shifting of relationships and partnerships. And that became really powerful. Those stories that emanated from that became really powerful. And they led to some of those more quantifiable measures for sure. But that how we were working differently together was such a lovely way of kind of thinking about the change that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point that, the relational change in and of itself, people aren't going to get too excited about unless they can see it leading to, the structural change. And of course, that's change in a system that itself is not changing outcomes. So there's a lot going on there, and whether or not we can draw, the right level of relationships between everything, it's something we all need to keep working on.
Hey, Duncan, I think we're coming to the end of our time. So before I throw it over to you for the final set of announcements and things like that, John, I want to thank you so much. I mean, my mind is racing in a million different directions, and I can see lots of connections between, the journey of collective impact, and then what some of the conversations that you and I have had over time, and also where you're leading now. And I'm quite excited about this this collective change lab idea, and we hope that Tamarack can play some kind of a role in it as it continues to evolve, and look forward to that. So Duncan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz, and thanks, John, for sharing your wisdom with us today. I just have a few quick announcements of some upcoming learning opportunities. If you enjoyed this webinar, Tamarack Institute is hosting a weekly webinar series through the fall, and you can learn more about that at tamarackcommunity.ca. You can also visit our website to learn about the next few opportunities as well. You can join Liz next week for a workshop on building trust in virtual teams. It's, I think, maybe the fourth or fifth time we've hosted this workshop, and it's a really excellent exploration into the role of trust. We also have Collective Impact 3.0, Designing a Movement for Change. We have 2 dates for this new virtual workshop to dig into the impact of building a movement. And lastly, during the summer, we launched a new online course called Foundations of Community Engagement. And it's a learn at your own pace learning opportunity with Lisa Atikla, who I think is actually hiding in the audience of this webinar today. It's a really great experience of learning to take a community engagement initiative from conception through to evaluation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. As I mentioned before, everyone on this call will receive a full recording of the discussion, a PDF of the slides, as well as links to the resources that were mentioned today. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.